and we'll see if anybody has any questions or comments about what we've gone over so far, and then we'll dive right into it. Before we get too far into it, though, I think what I'd like to do is do a little bit of an overview of the Sermon on the Mount, and then maybe on the last 15-20 minutes or so, maybe even more than that, is like what do you want to talk about in the Sermon on the Mount? Because like there's no way we can go verse by verse like with this, right? So I think I would wanting me hearing what verses jump out at you and which ones speak to you and what would you like to discuss and chew on a little bit more. I will say, if you have any questions about the Lord's Prayer, I would direct you to a sermon series I did this summer. We went line by line on that, so I'd like to actually kind of jump over the Lord's Prayer. Just say you can go on YouTube, and everything everything I would want to say about it is already online. But before we go to prayer, I will say, as just a hole in your hearts, we got an email. Maybe some of you who are on the national UCC email listserv got the same email, but we lost 2 UCC churches in the hurricane, and this Sunday we'll do a special appeal for anyone who wishes to donate to that, and many other churches were damaged, and that is not to say the other things that are going on in people's lives. Tammy did get she did get power back Monday night about 9 p.m. And so and she went back to class today, so that was that's good for her. But I know there's lots of other folks who are struggling, and
does she have a support group down there? I know
she doesn't really. No, I mean, she's down there basically by herself. I mean, besides some of the students that she's already met in class and stuff like that. But no, she doesn't really. Yeah, she isn't. But like I said, we lost two churches, UCC churches, which I know there's a lot of other things going on, but just to keep that in mind. And then the other thing is keep our colleague over at the UCC church in Lowell, Reverend Shannon. She is on her dad's side of the family, Lebanese by background, and her grandparents and cousins have been evacuated from Beirut. And so that's a really scary time for their family. So if you could please keep them in your prayers as well. I know that they're very, very scared. And we just want to keep that whole region, hopefully that God's peace can protect the people who are innocent in that conflict. So let's go to God in a word of prayer. Loving God, we give you thanks for this beautiful and blessed day and bringing us together in this community of love. We lift up to you our friends, our family, our community members, our nation, our world. Turning them over to your mercy, your grace, your love, your compassion, and that you would work through us to be agents of those ideals, and so that we may bear good fruit of your kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. But as we study your word this day and hear this sermon of Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount, help us glean meaning and inspiration and guidance from it. Be with each and every one of us this day, and we ask this in your Son's holy name, and all of God's children said, Amen. Any questions, comments, thoughts from what we've discussed before? Anything from chapters 1 through 4?
I have one stupid question.
No such thing.
They're always, you have to have someone that always has a stupid question. Okay, the Star of David.
Yeah.
Is that a star that's still up there?
Yeah.
Or did it only come out at that time?
That's a great question. That's a really great question. So yes, I'm going to say yes to both of those questions, both of those things. So I mean, I guess there is a chance that star has exploded since then. But it was a celestial event. So and a star that in a celestial event that the Magi were looking for. And it had a purpose prior to that. So more than one thing can be true at the same time, right?
Sure, why not?
In terms of like, think about the meaning behind Halley's Comet.
Yeah.
Before science kind of explained what Halley's Comet was, there were, folks around the world who had given meaning to that thing. So, so more than one thing can be true about a celestial event. It can both be sort of seen as like a divine, message and a divine, indicator of something, but it also could have some other meaning as well. It doesn't have to be one or the other. So what we consider to be the Star of David, that celestial event, I'd have to look up to see if it is actually still,
It just seems like it's so special.
It is.
Obviously, that it came there. And it's like, did it only come for that time?
Yeah.
Or if I go out there and look, would I still be able
Sure.
to see it?
Sure.
Just not a question,
Yeah.
I know, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's not. It's not. A lot of people thought it was like the North Star, right, or something
Yeah.
like that, and things, but it's not. It's something completely different. And I didn't actually bring my notes from last week, so I'd have to go back and look to see where that scripture verse is. I think I pointed it out where you can look to see where that prophecy comes from. But that's a great question. Yeah.
Just wondered if I could see it yet.
Let me look that up. Let's see. That's a great question.
Special.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions or thoughts from the last couple of weeks? Anything? All right, well, let's jump into the Sermon on the Mount. So I want to begin by saying you'll remember from the very first time together, or maybe you watched the introduction online after I finally got the technology figured out. And I mentioned that there were 5 discourses that Matthew uses to sort of organize his gospel. And the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5 through 7, is the first discourse. And if you look at chapter 7:29, we see that lovely phrase that I mentioned was a sign, a signal that a discourse was ending. And so chapter 8, now when Jesus had finished saying these things, you remember that whenever you see the words, the phrase, now when Jesus had finished, that closes out a discourse. So everything up to chapter 5 is considered the prologue, and it's a lot of stories that are told in other gospels. It sort of kind of sets the scene for this sermon that we're about to hear, about to read. But think of the Sermon on the Mount. Right? Does it sound like a sermon to you? I think that's a great question. Does it sound like a sermon? When you think of a sermon,
It's pretty disjointed.
okay, so the theme sort of goes all, it kind of moves themes fairly quickly. We're used to the minister droning on a little longer. Right, that's the classic, right? 3 points in a poem. That's what it used to be, 3 points in a poem. Now we still tell stories and all that sort of jazz, but 3 points in a song. So what it's almost like we're only hearing Jesus's side of the conversation. So in first century rabbinical teaching, a typical way that a rabbi would give a sermon is, you actually get to see a lot of it, which is Jesus sat down to talk to his disciples. That is the typical way in first century Judaism that a rabbi would give a sermon. It wouldn't be from a pulpit, it would be sitting with folks. And then the rabbi would give an exposition on the Torah, on the prophets, on morals and ethics, and then there would be a conversation between the rabbi and the disciples. And so we don't get the disciple side of the conversation here at all. We're only getting the synthesis of the teaching of Jesus. So what we have here is a collection of teachings on religious life, on ethics, on God, on a lot of different topics, but we're only getting Jesus' side of the teaching. We're not getting the back and forth with the disciples, nor are we getting any of the other exposition that we would normally hear in a sermon. It is narrowed down to its, most fundamental parts. And so from the Sermon on the Mount, we're actually getting basically pieced together mini sermons that Matthew has put together to make one long discourse. And we call it the Sermon on the Mount. The only thing that we have like it in the New Testament is in Luke. In chapter 6 in Luke, we get what's called the Sermon on the Plain. It's not exactly the same teachings, but they're similar. And then there are some things that are taught in Matthew that are taught in, we have Jesus teaching in other gospels in completely different circumstances. Which, as an example, the Jesus teaching about the lilies of the field and the birds of the air, and don't worry about tomorrow. Today's worries are enough for today. That story or that teaching is given in the Gospel of Luke. But Jesus and his disciples are actually walking down the road, and his disciples actually point out and say, like, hey, look at those beautiful flowers. And Jesus uses that as an opportunity to say, let me talk to you a little bit about anxiety and worries and things of that nature. So it's not to say that Jesus didn't teach any type of good teacher knows they need to repeat it more than once. So it's not that things didn't, it could be a both and sort of situation. He said it out in this sort of context, but he also said it while walking along with the disciples as well at some point. But Matthew and Luke, should present those teachings in different contexts. So this is to say that this the Sermon on the Mount is a collection of teachings. It's not one through sermon. Like but Matthew presents it that way as a discourse, and so that's the way to think of the Sermon on the Mount. That's why, Bruce, as you mentioned, it jumps from topic to topic, because it's actually a lot of sermons condensed into one narrative here. There's also no witty introduction and any of those stuff. It's not a narrative. It's really kind of the crux of the teaching. So, and then if you want to divide up the Sermon on the Mount, you can do so with each chapter. So you can look at the chapter 5 with the two major portions of chapter 5 being the Beatitudes and what are called the antitheses. So the Beatitudes are chapter 5, verse 3 through 11. And then there's some other teachings kind of put in there. Some of them very famous, like you are the salt of the earth, and you're called to be the light of the world. Some very famous ones. But then you also have the antitheses, which are chapter 5, 21 through 48, which is you have heard it said, but I say to you. And I want to look at a couple of those here with you here in a second. Then chapter 6 is basically called the teachings on piety. And almost all of chapter 6 deals with what it means to live a pious life. And then the last one, chapter 7, is kind of considered to be a chapter on ethics. And so you can break it down thematically, though ethics makes its way all the way through and things of that nature.
Darryl?
Yeah.
Jesus is very careful to tell them that what he's teaching isn't gonna conflict with the law, the prophets.
Right.
Is most of this stuff that he's telling them pretty bizarre for them or odd?
No. That's a great question, John. I really appreciate you asking that. It is an intensification of what they have, because they're also all Jews too, right? And they've all been to synagogue and they've all learned the prophets and the Torah and everything like that. So it is intensifying and expanding what they have already kind of heard and what they've already learned. Much of like take the antithesis of, you've heard it said,
43.
yeah, 43, thank you. You have heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. That's right out of Torah, right? But then he says, but I say to you, I love your enemy. So he's taking what they know and then he's expanding it, right? He's taking that idea of Jewish, that charge for the community to take care of each other. And now he's expanding that out and saying, like, no, you have to apply that to people who are not, in your clan, right? In your tribe. He's expanding on the tribe. He's sort of dismantling the tribalism there. So it's not it wouldn't, those first lines would not have been unfamiliar to them. Many of the Beatitudes even have roots in the Psalms or in the Torah or in, I wrote one down. So take, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. So that is almost a direct quote from Psalm 37. Blessed, it says, happy are the meek, and it talks about inheriting the land. So that would not have been an unfamiliar teaching to them. Jesus, this is why I often say to y'all, we have to have an appreciation for Judaism to really truly understand Jesus, right? And because he really grows right out of that. He never rejects his upbringing. He really just says, this is the way I was raised. Now let me apply it in this beautiful, wonderful way for everything, sort of thing. So let's look at these Beatitudes. So that first word is Greek, called, and the Greek word there is Mariakis. Sorry, Markarius. I got it wrong. Markarius. And it has 3 English translations. And I'm wondering I want to hear if anybody's got what your first word of a beatitude is. What word does your translation have? Blessed. Anyone have anything other than blessed? There are 2 other very appropriate translations. One is favored. So favored are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Though those who mourn might not feel like they're in a very favorable position. Favored are the meek. Favored are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. So favored is one of the ways that word can be translated. The other one is happy. So you might have heard like happy, which is actually the direct quote from Psalm 37. Happy are the meek, for they shall inherit the land and everything. So you might, depending on the translation, you might see either one of those, but mostly what scholars and preachers and ministers and people, the one thing we agree on is that is a really hard word to get a grasp on. What really does that really mean? And none of those 3 English translations really bring out everything and it really is one of the most mysterious teachings of Jesus are the Beatitudes. And you just sort of have to live into them to really understand them. I'd like to hear like any feedback you have or any thoughts you have on the Beatitudes, on that word, on anything.
I just want to say that, so for blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted.
Yeah.
I was reading the little clip notes down here.
Yeah.
And it said, mourn perhaps for one's sins. And I never thought about it being like that.
I've never heard it.
I know.
I've never thought of it that way.
Me either. Okay. It was just kind of weird. I was like, I guess I
Yeah.
never interpreted it that way. So,
I've always thought of it really as mourning the loss of
Yeah.
A loved
person
one,
or-
yeah, person, yeah, something, yeah. Other thoughts about blood, I mean, the Beatitudes are an incredibly essential part of Jesus's teachings. And really hard to grasp
It
and,
seems to me that blessed and favored are pretty close.
Yeah.
Happy's a little bit different to
yeah,
me.
yeah. A lighter, not as heavy of a, not
Yeah.
as weighty, maybe that's the right word, not as weighty.
Maybe not as connected to, God and the host of hosts.
Yeah, yeah. What's interesting is chapter 7, I'm sorry, verse 7 of chapter 5, blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Merciful is one of, there's a formulaic, we often talk about, if you attend Park for, say, 2 months straight, the way that we will, the most common adjective we use for God is loving, right? Or gracious, or those are probably the two that you would hear us use. In ancient Judaism, the most common adjectives for God are merciful and just. And so basically it says, blessed are the merciful. So it's almost saying blessed are the godlike, because they will receive godness, like it is sort of thing. So, but yeah, merciful and just, if you go through the common prayers of Judaism, that is the most common. Merciful and just God, God who is merciful and just, God who treats us mercifully and justly, those are the most common, which is, yeah. And then last, I will just say, one of the best sermons I've ever heard on chapter 5, verse 9, blessed are the peacemakers, is the fact that, like, we are called, it might be a call from Jesus to enter conflict. Like, if you're gonna make peace, that means there had to be no peace ahead of time, and we are called therefore to enter into that situation, which is incredibly challenging and scary, and is to seek out places that are situations that are in conflict, so that we may make peace in those places, which is a special calling. Not all of us are, not all of us have that skill set. I often make things worse. So anyway, that's any of the other ones, any of the Beatitudes speak to y'all that are your favorites, or that have?
Mine, the
Yeah.
first words are spiritually blessed on
Oh.
each one of them.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Yeah, that's interesting. They're trying to come up with a way to figure it out.
Yeah.
Yeah, that translation, they were just like,
Yeah.
that's good. I like it. I like that a lot. Any other comments or thoughts? So chapter 5, verse 11, blessed are you when you are, when people revile you and persecute you, and utter all kinds of evil against you. I think one of the more inspired inclusions of Matthew, including that particular beatitude in this, is so much of the first century church did live as a persecuted, people, being persecuted by the Jewish leadership, being persecuted by other religious sects, or being persecuted by the Romans. And so that could be a word of hope for those who are living in that situation. And I've always remembered that my church in San Diego that I served, we hosted a delegation from China, and they often said that beatitude was the one that really spoke to them, because it was a word of hope and a word of strength and courage, and it's because we worship in relative safety. The people who feel persecuted religiously in the United States are not persecuted religiously like so many other people around the world are religiously persecuted. You have to do something pretty outrageous to go to jail. For your religious, I mean, as long as you're not skinning cats, like you're really not gonna go to, you're not really gonna go to jail for your religious beliefs. So, it's a level of persecution that is on a different level, and our friends in China and other places are really live that in a much different way.
My impression of the Beatitudes is they're, words of hope,
Yeah,
that, you know, it's more than anything else than words of hope.
yeah. And to think that that's how the Sermon on the Mount begins, with those words of hope. That's a great comment, Bruce. I appreciate you sharing that. Let's look at some of these, antitheses. So they start on chapter 5, verse 21. And they do not necessarily undo the teaching. Like I said, they can either expand it or intensify it, amplify it, if you will. So, and of course, there's the famous one. Wasn't it Jimmy Carter? God love him, he turned 100. Yeah,
Adultery.
about adultery, right? Wasn't it
No,
Jimmy
that's
Carter
very
that like made like sort of thing? I thought as I was reading it, everybody was like, what? Yeah, right. I always contend Jimmy Carter and George W. Bush are the two most religious presidents of my lifetime. And really took it pretty seriously, from all accounts. And so, yeah, so I thought it was because I was young. I was like,
You didn't know what adultery was.
I didn't even know what adultery was. I was like 3. I didn't know who Jimmy Carter was at 3. God love him. He did turn 100. He did. God love him. He had cancer for 9 years.
Well, he's been in hospice for like almost.
I
a year
know.
and a
He wants
half
to
or
stick
something.
around long enough to vote.
Yes.
Is that what he
does.
said?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, good luck. Godspeed to him.
Take it early vote.
Yeah.
Absentee. Absentee ballot. That's such a good point. I appreciate you saying that. He could do an absentee. That's fun.
It does not count if you die.
Yeah. it's-
I know, I already asked that question.
Even
What,
if it's
really?
beforehand, really.
That's good to know. All
I
right.
mean, I know that because my mother had.
That's
died
so
at the end of
interesting.
October in her birthday.
No way. That's so interesting. I did not know that. So-
Someone checks.
Right.
Yeah.
I will say, one of the more particularly in 21st century American, life, the adultery, the divorce, teaching is often problematic for folks. And, I don't try to beat around the bush around it. I don't try to explain it away. I just try to say, Jesus as a product of his time, that would have been the norm. I mean, that just would have been the norm. But there are circumstances in the 21st century that are not applicable to the first century at all. And that's the reason why laws, evolve. But yes, Jesus very much understood the value of familial relationships, though he's very hard on his mother. There's no doubt about that. He's very hard on Mary. But he is, has a very keen understanding of the value of family and the value of community. And in the first century, there were very few reasons that were legally bound to allow divorce. But in no way, shape, or form does Jesus ever advocate for abusive relationships, unfaithful relationships, any of those type of things. And so, I always just like some people always say like, in particular, I'm divorced. I'm a divorced person. And so it's not easy to read, right? But, so anyway, I always like to make sure that we point that out. Can we jump ahead to chapter 6? Let's jump ahead to chapter 6 real quick. before we turn it over to, because I'd really like to hear which teachings you'd like to talk a little bit more about. So piety is a public display of your religious faith. And there are three primary, deeply traditional acts of piety. And I want to ask you, where do you hear us talk about these things in our church? Traditionally, pious acts of a faithful person would be giving alms, praying, and fasting. When do we talk about alms, prayer, and fasting? Lent, right. So those are the traditional Lenten disciplines. And so they are time tested and have great value. And so what Jesus is, the way I read this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, is Jesus is trying to make those acts pure and trying to teach us to have the heart and the spirit behind it that it's meant for, which is helping the less fortunate in terms of almsgiving, in terms of connecting with God in prayer, and instead of making a big thing about it. There is actually a Greek word that doesn't get translated in this section, and that is the word hypocrite. Hypocrite is actually a Greek word that has no English translation. It's Greek. But in Greek, it means actor. And so if we were Greek-speaking people, we would, and Tom Hanks walked in, we might call him a hypocrite. Because that's his profession, he's an actor. But that's what actually, hypocrite is a Greek word that has no English translation. We just use the Greek. But it actually translates actor. And so a person who is a hypocrite is someone who is praying and acting like they are doing, but really their motivations and their feelings are. And if there's one class of people that Jesus seems to have very little patience for, it is hypocrites.
Darryl, and it says, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be honored by men, I tell you the truth, they have received the reward in full. What is their reward?
Yeah, the reward is the adulation of the crowd, of the.
Okay, so it's nothing,
No,
okay.
yeah, you've received what you wanted. By putting on this act, you wanted people to think that you're a good person, to give you the accolades that you've received exactly what you wanted.
Okay.
But there is no depth in that. I thank you for bringing that up, John. That's actually one of my favorite things that Jesus says. I think he's so spot on. You actually, like the hypocrite, the actor, is actually getting exactly what they want, which is the adulation of the crowd. But there's something deeper that we should be working for.
And you'll be rewarded by God.
Yeah. I actually love that teaching. I appreciate you bringing that up. Yeah. He doesn't say they won't be rewarded. He said they already got what they wanted. Thank you for sharing that, or thank you for bringing that up. Which is kind of the same about the treasures. He doesn't say that, he never says that those who try to store up their treasures on earth don't get treasure. Like they actually get their treasure, but he wants us to have a higher calling there. There's also no historic. I always like to point out that there is actually, I don't know where he comes up with chapter 6 verse 2. So whenever you give alms, do not sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues. I don't know what he's talking about. Like there's no historical evidence that whenever people would give to it made me think of the Salvation Army at outside Meyer, whenever you put something they ring the ding,
My
ding,
Bible
ding.
says perhaps a reference to the noise made by coins as they were thrown.
Oh, maybe see, there you go. That's good. That's good.
Oh, and mine says sounding a trumpet is probably metaphorical, as in blow your own horn.
Yeah, that's good too. That's good too, because I was like, I actually looked that up. I was like, there's no historical evidence that they, whenever people, that would be fun though. People gave large gifts, just like blow the horn. Yeah, so that, I mean, so you, all through chapter 6, you have all, teachings on alms, you have teachings on prayer, you have teachings on fasting. And I will say, so I fast on Ash Wednesday, right? I always would get yelled at by my colleagues in San Diego because we would do a joint Ash Wednesday service together, and they're like, "We should have a potluck beforehand." I'm like, "It's a fast day. Like, why are we?" They're like, "No, people want to get together," and I was like, "Fine," but I didn't do it. And because of this teaching, I would iron, and I would shave, and I would do my hair, and I didn't want anybody to like see me as miserable as I actually was, because I was taking that very, very seriously. But I do fast on 2 days out of the year. I fast Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. No eating on those days. Does anyone fast? Have we ever done a fast here?
I think that, well, I think sometime we have, but
Okay.
I don't know. I think the kids did it one, like the youth group did it, but maybe.
To raise money
Yeah.
for like hunger
Yeah,
relief
they
or
could
something?
drink, but they couldn't.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Yeah.
they ate enough.
Anybody intermittent fast? Anybody giving that a try? Intermittent fast. Did that work for you, Carla?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where, for me, it's because of my husband's schedule, a lot of times we don't eat dinner until like 7:30. And so I was waking up and not really hungry in the morning, but eating, because, it's like what you do, you wake up, you eat. And so I started doing that, and I was surprised that it was cool, I don't want to say cool, but, eat when you're hungry. I mean, it's,
Yeah.
and sometimes it may be noon, 1 o'clock or so. And, yeah, I think my body likes it better.
Yeah. People who've done it, have had good results. I mean, results in terms of how they feel. I mean,
Right, I
that's-
mean, I can't say that, some people do it to lose weight, and I've had success. I mean, I used to because I really wasn't hungry, so I eat.
Sure. Last but certainly not least, before I turn it over to y'all, let's see which ones you really want to dive more into, is, you have the chapter 7 really can be, like I said, summed up on, a sort of a chapter on ethics in terms of judgment, in terms of, chapter 12, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It really is just sort of these pithy, sort of ethical, kind of teachings by him. And a lot of, and if you turn to chapter 7, verse 15, you get the teachings on false prophets. And so this bewaring of false prophets. And so, again, not, if you kind of put on the lens of like, what is Matthew trying to provide for his church that he's writing the gospel for? Not only were there false messiahs, in the days of Jesus, but following Jesus's death and resurrection, there was a proliferation of what?
Copycat.
Of copycats. That's a great way of putting it, Bruce. Yeah, of copycats, and particularly inside the church, right? They would infiltrate the church, and so much of Peter's, letters are about, who told you that? Why are you following that teaching? That's not what we taught you, sort of thing. And so, so Matthew could be taking a teaching that Jesus is actually giving in a slightly different context, but actually providing it for his church as a way to encourage them not to follow these folks who are undoing some of the things that are, that the apostles and Peter and stuff and Paul were kind of laying the groundwork for. And so it's another word of encouragement from Matthew the context that Jesus is saying it is slightly different from the context from the reader. The reader is actually reading it. And so the meanings, it's one of those teachings that has the opportunity to have multiple layers to it from the time that Jesus is talking about it versus the time that the first century church is reading it versus when we're reading it, right? You know, it might have a different connotation to us these days, who is a false prophet and how they might be kind of turning us, turning us astray, or who might feel like they're a wolf in sheep's clothing sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, that's the kind of the overview that I wanted to do. We got about 10 to 15 more minutes. So what are your favorite teachings? How many famous verses are in just these 3 chapters? And which ones would y'all, yeah, Tim?
I have one for you.
Good.
It always popped for me for Sermon on the Mount. Chapter 5, verses 17, 18, 19.
Okay. Chapter 5, verse 17, 18, and 19. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of the letter will pass from the law until it is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So tell me, Tim, what?
Well, I always thought Matthew was big on linking the Old Testament to
Yeah.
the New Testament. This seems like a mission statement or a treatise. And I'm really interested more what you think of it.
Yeah, that's thanks.
Yeah.
Is it the type of questions I ask people to submit ahead of time, Tim? But no, I think. I mean, I think my personal opinion about them is the way that.
We could pick it up next week.
No. I find it interesting that Jesus, the preacher, doesn't seem to necessarily live into that completely. Because there are, in terms of the specificity of the Torah and of the law, particularly in like Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, that kind of thing, there are certain things that he seems to discard. Take the teaching that he does later on in the gospel that we'll get to on the Sabbath. That's very much Torah teaching. It's very laid out, but then he sort of contradicts that, right? And says like, the Sabbath isn't for the Sabbath. We aren't made for the Sabbath. The Sabbath is made for us. And if we need to, tweak that and everything, then we need to be able to do that. And so he's actually, and you could kind of almost say like, well, he's not doing it to the letter of the Torah. Instead, he's kind of living into the spirit of the Torah, right? And I think that's the way I've always looked at what he's meant by, I've come to fulfill, not to abolish the Torah, the law. Is for us to not live by it by like the letter of it, but to live into the spirit of it, which is really about how do we live in community with one another? How do we live? How do we, praise and worship God? How do we, how do we act justly and equitably? Like people forget that like the eye for the eye teaching isn't a teaching about vengeance. It's actually a teaching about not going farther than that. If the lex talionis, right? That's what it's called, the lex talionis. So if Janet, cuts off my hand and, then I can't go more than that in a retaliation. And so it actually is a limitation. We actually think of it, a lot of times we think of it as, it prevents us from, we think of it as vengeance, but it's actually trying to prevent escalation. And so, You know, so, but he kind of turns it around, right? And says like, no, you've heard it said, but, so he actually kind of contradicts himself, like almost immediately with the antithesis after saying that. You know,
He seems to be drawing a line, but I think you're right. It says I'm not here to abolish the law, but to fulfill it.
to fulfill it,
Which,
right?
which means that this is add-on value.
Yeah.
But I don't know, that always popped me. It seemed like a treatise. And,
Yeah. A mission statement is a good way to put it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, but it's hard. That's
It
why I
is.
asked, you know.
It is. but I would challenge anyone to live
No.
in the 21st century by the letter
Right.
of the Torah. It would be impossible for us in the 21st century to live by it. So we almost have to be spirit of the law people to be able to live into it, yeah. And by the way, I mean, we're not the only ones who feel that way. Talk to, you know, basically Judaism, particularly American Judaism, has seen that same, have made that same claim, right? There really is only the Hasidic, you know, communities who have maintained, you know, sort of an adherence to as much as they possibly can to 100% of the of Torah living. So, yeah, thanks, appreciate it. Got us off to a good start. What other ones?
The verse right after that.
The verse right after
Yeah.
that, verse 20.
Verse 20, for I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees and scribes, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. I thought, geez, I'm in trouble.
Well, except for,
Big trouble.
he has pretty low standards when it comes to the Pharisees and scribes. So, because I mean, honestly, he's really hard on the Pharisees and scribes. He really is. Some have said it's because like they were, you know, that he was actually one of them, you know, that he actually had Pharisaic training and then kind of split from them. But regardless, like, I don't know if that's as big of a hurdle as what you might think, a stumbling block is what you might think it when it comes to Jesus' teachings on the Pharisees and the scribes.
Because
But it is a call to, you're right, though, it is a challenge though, right? And he does want to challenge us. It's a good to set the bar high and have us reach for it rather than set the bar low and say like, well, anybody can do it. You know, because actually one of my favorite teachings is similar. It's the one where he says the path is narrow and anyone can walk around on a wide road, but I'm asking you to follow on the narrow road. And there's something about the challenge of being asked to do that.
you know what? I got to thinking, well, he contradicts himself. If John 14 is true, here I am, I save a place for you, and if I didn't, I would have told you. And geez, that's exactly opposite to what this is talking about.
Yeah, I think he's a challenge, Bruce. I mean, that's just my own thought is, he's setting a high bar and a high standard for us to meet. Yeah, Janet, do you have one? I thought maybe Janet, are you trying to pipe in?
No, I just was curious if anybody had read A.J. Jacobs' book, The Year of Living Biblically, where he tried to follow all the Old Testament rules. And then Dobson from Calvary here did the same thing with following the New Testament. And now Jacobs has another book out. I haven't read that one yet about trying to live constitutionally. Those are kind of fun books.
He followed it up with A Year of Living Constitutionally?
My Year of Living Biblically, I think it's called. A.J. Jacobs.
I know that one, and then he did
Yeah.
one.
He's got a new one out called My Year of Living Constitutionally or something like that. And he runs around with a tricorn hat. And I saw one interview, but I haven't read the book yet. And then Dobson, who was at Calvary Church, did one on the New Testament, trying to follow a lot of the New Testament things. So anyway, I was just...
Did you read those, John?
I read the Dobson one. It's entertaining.
Is it? Yeah. It's hard. It's hard. And not hard in like, you know, it's difficult because we just live in a completely different context. It's a completely.
Yeah, they're interesting books. They're kind of, and he's quite funny too. So
But yeah, that's a good endorsement. Thanks, Janet, appreciate it. Others, verses that jumped out at you that you would like to, or some of your favorite ones. We don't even have to discuss, you just want to say which ones are your favorites or the ones that speak to you.
Well, the do not worry, I probably should read once every week.
No,
Right.
you have that,
So
you have that
I
highlighted.
need to focus on that, but the wide and narrow, when I thought about it,
That's chapter, by the way, that's chapter 7, verse 13, if you're looking for it.
yeah, I, in my professional career, I always tried to do the narrow. And I find myself as kids now in their careers ask me questions about this and that one. I direct them in the narrow versus the wide. And so it's a good virtue for a lot of reasons, in a lot of situations. Because it's easy to take the easy ways.
It is, right. It is, you know, I mentioned I mean, it doesn't even have to be, it doesn't even have to have grave consequences, like, you know, your profession could have grave consequences, John. It might not even have grave. But I mentioned in a sermon, I was telling a story, it was during the Lord's Prayer sermon, the sermon series, if you want to listen to it, but it wasn't until I was an adult that I realized, growing up in a family system where lying was rationalized and normalized. And how much that had like affected me and like, and how I kind of had like unprogrammed myself from justifying taking the easy way by telling someone a half truth or a lie of omission or something like that, and then justifying it. And gosh, when you start telling the truth, and not in a mean way, not in that like snarky, like, oh, I'm the truth teller sort of way. I hate those things, but like really just telling people the truth and being honest with it. It is so freaking hard sometimes, and it can really cause pain. But the alternative is infinitely worse. My ex-wife actually once said to me, she was just like, you know, when you lie to me or don't tell me something, and you rationalize it to yourself by saying, I can't handle that. That's your rationalization. I didn't tell you because you can't handle it. She's like, you know what makes me so angry about that is that you're thinking for me, and that you don't trust me that I will be able to handle. Like, and I was like, oh my God, that's a truth that's hard to hear. Like, I was just like, oh my God, like, sort of, but and then doing the hard work in between that marriage falling apart and meeting Tammy, like, so I didn't go through the same thing. Like, so anyway, I read that scripture verse about the narrow road, and it's like the narrow road of truth it's not easy, but it's the way. It's those of you who. Anyway, that's my own story. Any others? I appreciate you bringing that up. Somebody want to bring us out on a really good one?
It's 1-1 in the first inning.
One in the first inning, right? What do we got? We got, we'll see. I don't want to look at the score yet.
I just told you.
It's it's great.
Yeah.
The one,
The narrow road.
oh, it's the narrow one. Anywho, anyway, that's the last. Let's just end with the last teaching then, which is everyone then who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be a wise man, a wise person who built his house on rock. And so that sort of solid foundation, I think that's a great way for the Sermon on the Mount to end. It really is about creating the solid foundation for our faith and our life, and our life in faith with one another and with God and inside ourselves. And you know, you can't help but like read that scripture verse and think of the 3 little pigs. Like, it just jumps out at you with the wind and the rain and the falling of the house and everything. But really, I think it's Matthew, as you put this together, I think did a beautiful job of ending with this of encouraging us to think about these teachings as the the solid foundation upon which our faith is really what we grow out and put it on. So,
It would be nice, like you said, if we could hear what the disciples are saying.
yeah, I would love to hear.
I mean,
Yeah.
You know, just as they were talking when, he said he was gonna go on the cross and they're going, what are you talking about? I'm
Right.
sure they're, after all this, they're going,
Yeah,
I don't.
yeah, the narrow path. I gave up everything for you. And like, I'm here, and then, which is what they'll say, in a couple of chapters. So I think next week we're doing 8 and 9, yes? Is that what we're doing next week? 8 and 9? Okay, so if you could please read chapters 8 and chapters 9, and just a reminder, then we'll take a week off, as I'll be coming home from Dallas. So, thank you, everybody, for coming. We'll see each other again. Thanks, everybody. Bye, Janet. Bye, Donna.